In the last season of the HerStory Buff, I explored the life of India's first female Prime Minister, Indira Ghandi, a remarkable leader who came to power in 1966. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, I highly recommend checking it out. But Ghandi was the world's second female Prime Minister. Another trailblazing woman claimed the title of the world's first female Prime Minister, and she came from the same part of the world. She hailed from the small island nation just south of India, Sri Lanka, known as Ceylon at the time. Sirimavo Bandaranaike became Prime Minister of Ceylon in 1960, 6 years before her Indian counterpart and nearly 2 decades before Margaret Thatcher in Britain. Remarkably, during her tenure, Ceylon's head of state was still Queen Elizabeth II, making it the first time in history that both the head of state and head of government were women. Bandaranaike served 3 terms as Prime Minister, first from 1960 to 1965, then from 1970 to 1977, overseeing the country's transition to the Republic of Sri Lanka in 1972, and finally from 1994 to 2000. But how did she rise to the highest office in the land at a time when most Western nations were far from electing a female leader? What were her politics? And what is her legacy in Sri Lanka today? Join me in this episode of HerStory Buff, a special series on women in history, as we delve into the life and impact of this groundbreaking leader who shattered the glass ceiling long before many others. Sirimavo Bandaranaike was born Sirima Ratwate on the 17th of April 1916 into a wealthy and politically influential family in Ceylon, a former British colony, but by then a self-governing dominion within the Commonwealth. She grew up in a privileged environment as part of the Kandyan Sinhalese caste. Her father, Barnes Ratwate, was a native headman and politician, while her mother, Rosalind Hilda Mahawalatane Kumarehame, was an informal Ayurvedic doctor. The Ratwate family had deep roots in the Kandyan aristocracy, with connections to the Kingdom of Kandy, and notable figures like her uncle, Sir Jayatilu Kuchuda Ratwate, the first person from Kandy to receive a British knighthood. Sirima was the eldest of 6 children, with 4 brothers and 1 sister. She grew up in her maternal grandfather's estate before moving to the family's own estate in Balangoda. Her early education included time at a private kindergarten in Balangoda, Ferguson High School in Ratnapura, and finally St. Bridget's Convent in Colombo. Despite being educated in Catholic school, she remained a practicing Buddhist throughout her life and was fluent in both English and Sinhala, one of the main languages of Sri Lanka today, alongside Tamil. After finishing her education at 19, Sirima became involved in social work, focusing on improving living standards for village women through food distribution, medicine, and organizing clinics. She held various roles in the Social Service League until her marriage in 1940. Her parents arranged her marriage to Solomon West Ridgway Diaz, or SWRD Bandaranaike, a politician and lawyer, despite initial hesitations due to class differences. The couple agreed to the union, and they married in what was dubbed the wedding of the century. Following her marriage, Sirima dedicated herself to raising her 3 children, Sunethra, Chandrika, and Anura, whilst also supporting her husband's political career. The family split their time between their home in Colombo and SWRD's ancestral manor. All 3 children later pursued education abroad and returned to serve in the Sri Lankan government. In addition to her family responsibilities, Sirima was actively involved in social organisations, including the Lanka Mahila Samiti, where she focused on women's empowerment, disaster relief, and agricultural projects. She held various leadership positions in these organisations and participated in many social initiatives. Sirima supported her husband during his political career, including his decision to resign from the long-established and dominant United National Party in 1951 to form the Sri Lankan Freedom Party, or SLFP, a left-wing nationalist party. In the general election held a year later in 1952, the new party won 9 seats. Then, in the 1956 election, SWRD campaigned on a platform of obtaining true independence for Sri Lanka, with a nationalist, democratic and socialist programme, which saw the SLFP win a huge victory and SWRD became Prime Minister. During SWRD Bandaranaike's term as Prime Minister, he achieved significant milestones, including transferring major defence facilities from British to local control, shifting Ceylon's foreign policy towards the non-alignment movement, and lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. His government also benefited working people by establishing the Employees' Provident Fund and empowering peasants through the Paddy Lands Act. He improved healthcare and education by establishing Ayurvedic research centres, recognising native doctors, and allowing students to learn their mother tongue. Notably, in 1956, Sinhala replaced English as the official language, though attempts to accommodate Tamil concerns were met with opposition. On the morning of the 25th of September 1959, while at home on Rosmead Place in Colombo, Sirimavo witnessed her husband SWRD being shot multiple times by a Buddhist monk who was upset over perceived neglect of traditional medicine. Bandaranaike accompanied her husband to the hospital, where he died the following day. The ensuing political turmoil under the caretaker government of Wijayananda Bandaranaike saw many cabinet members removed and some arrested in connection with the assassination. The Mahajana Eskath Peramuna coalition collapsed, leading to elections being called for March 1960. Although Bandaranaike initially agreed to run as an independent candidate, she withdrew when Parliament was dissolved. In the March 1960 election, the United National Party won a 4-seat majority, and Dudley Senanayake, the new Prime Minister, was soon defeated in a no-confidence motion, which prompted another general election for July 1960. In May 1960, Bandaranaike was unanimously elected leader of the Freedom Party, despite being hesitant about running in the upcoming election. By early June, she began campaigning, promising to continue her husband's policies, including establishing a republic, making Sinhala the official language, and recognizing Buddhism while respecting the estate Tamils language and Hindu faith. The estate Tamils, originally brought to Ceylon by the British as plantation workers, were stateless due to the 1948 Citizenship Act, which excluded them from citizenship. Bandaranaike pledged to uphold her late husband's moderate approach towards these Tamils, in contrast to her successor Dudley Senanayake's more stringent repatriation policies. Her emotional campaign, where she would frequently burst into tears as she pledged to continue her husband's legacy, earned her the nickname the Weeping Widow from critics. On the 21st of July 1960, after a landslide victory for the Freedom Party, Sirimavo Bandaranaike was sworn in as the world's first female Prime Minister, alongside her roles as Minister of Defence and External Affairs. Bandaranaike initially faced challenges in managing the country's issues, relying heavily on her nephew, Felix Dias Bandaranaike. Despite her efforts to advance her late husband's policies, such as nationalising key industries and reforming education, she faced criticism and sexism. Her government also nationalised the parochial schools, affecting the Catholic minority and expanding Buddhist influence. In January 1961, she introduced a law making Sinhala the official language, which led to significant unrest among Tamil speakers, prompting a state of emergency. In response to rising domestic and international challenges, Bandaranaike sought to balance foreign relations by strengthening ties with China while maintaining connections with India, Russia, and British interests. She played a key role in peace efforts between India and China during their border conflict in 1962. However, her government faced economic difficulties, high inflation, and strikes, leading to the nationalisation of several sectors and further unrest, including an aborted coup d'etat attempt from the military. By 1964, Bandaranaike's government faced internal strife and opposition, culminating in the controversial press takeover bill aimed at nationalising newspapers. This led to a split in her coalition and vote loss, leading to defeat in the March 1965 general election. This election ended her first term as Prime Minister. In the 1965 election, Sirimavo Bandaranaike secured a seat in the House of Representatives and became the first female leader of the opposition, while Dudley Senanayake was sworn in as Prime Minister on the 25th of March 1965. Her tenure as an MP was fraught with controversy, including an investigation into allegations of accepting a bribe, but she was cleared of any wrongdoing. During her 5 years in opposition, she maintained alliances with leftist parties and led the opposition to win 6 of 7 by-elections from November 1966 to April 1967. Amid widespread discontent over inflation, trade imbalances, and austerity measures, Bandaranaike campaigned vigorously in 1969 with promises to return to power, including pledges to nationalise foreign banks, curb corruption, and revise the constitution. In the May 1970 election, Bandaranaike's United Front coalition won a decisive victory, leading to her reappointment as Prime Minister. By July, she convened a constitutional assembly to draft a new constitution, replacing the British drafted one, and introduced land reforms aimed at enhancing expertise in government ministries and involving citizens through people's committees. Despite these efforts to eliminate colonial influence, Bandaranaike faced significant economic challenges, including budget deficits and declining export revenues. She attempted to centralize the economy and manage price controls, but struggled with rising inflation and unemployment. Her government faced a severe test with the 1971 Janata Vimukti Peramuna or JVP insurrection, which led to a state of emergency being declared and required international support to quell. Despite these challenges, Bandaranaike's administration successfully managed the crisis and introduced the 1972 constitution, transforming Ceylon into the Republic of Sri Lanka and extending her term by 2 years. Major land reforms and nationalisation efforts followed, but economic difficulties persisted, exacerbated by the 1973 oil crisis and subsequent inflation. Her efforts to curb dissent, such as shutting down independent newspapers and expelling coalition partners, along with allegations of corruption, eroded her popularity. By the 1977 election, the United Front was defeated, capturing only 6 seats amidst growing separatist movements and domestic unrest. In the 1977 general election, Bandaranaike retained her parliamentary seat. The 1978 constitution introduced a French-style presidential system, which created new political dynamics, but failed to quell Tamil Sinhalese violence. The 1979 Prevention of Terrorism Act was enacted in response to ongoing unrest. In 1980, a special presidential commission accused Bandaranaike of power abuses, leading to a parliamentary motion that stripped her and her nephew of their civil rights for 7 years. Bandaranaike was expelled from parliament, but remained the Freedom Party leader. Her son Anura took over as party leader, while her daughter Chandrika formed a rival party. The government continued to face severe violence, culminating in the anti-Tamil pogroms of the Black July riots of 1983. Despite the political turmoil, Bandaranaike's civil rights were restored in 1986. She opposed the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord and ran for president in 1988, but lost narrowly. As leader of the opposition from 1989, she survived an assassination attempt and opposed the government's military strategy against the Tamil Tigers, who wanted an independent Tamil state. Bandaranaike supported efforts to impeach President Premadasa, but the motion failed. As her health started to decline, her daughter Chandrika took on a more prominent role, becoming Prime Minister in August 1994 before being elected President in November that same year. In the general election that year, Sirimavo was re-elected to Parliament and appointed as Minister without portfolio in her daughter's cabinet, though she remained largely wheelchair-bound due to health issues. In the November presidential election, Bandaranaike's daughter Chandrika Kumaratunga's main rival, Gamani Disayanake, was assassinated 2 weeks before voting. His widow, Srima Disayanake, was selected as the United National Party's candidate. Despite the tragedy, Chandrika was already predicted to win by a significant margin and secured a decisive victory. She became Sri Lanka's first female president and appointed her mother, Bandaranaike, as Prime Minister. However, under the 1978 constitution, Bandaranaike was responsible for defence and foreign affairs, but the role had become largely ceremonial. Despite this, Bandaranaike retained substantial influence within the Freedom Party. Although they aligned on policy, Kumaratunga and Bandaranaike had differing leadership styles. By 2000, Kumaratunga sought a younger prime minister, leading to Bandaranaike to resign in August 2000 because of her ailing health. Just a few months later, on the 10th of October 2000, Bandaranaike died from a heart attack in Kadawata while heading home to Colombo after casting her vote in the parliamentary election. Sri Lanka observed 2 days of national mourning, with state radio stations dedicating their programming to funeral laments. Her remains were placed in state at Parliament before her funeral at Horagola, where she was buried in the mausoleum built for her husband. Bandaranaike's tenure marked a significant shift from Sri Lanka's colonial past toward political independence. Her socialist policies aimed to nationalise key economic sectors and reform land ownership, targeting socio-economic and ethnic disparities. As a founder of the non-aligned movement, she positioned Sri Lanka as a neutral player during the Cold War and opposed nuclear expansion. Despite her symbolic role as the world's first female prime minister, Bandaranaike's impact on women's political representation in Sri Lanka was limited. Her appointment of family members to high positions and the continued low political participation of women highlighted the challenges in advancing gender equality. In 2010, on the 50th anniversary of her first election as Prime Minister, Sri Lankan parliamentarian Rosie Senanayake noted that women's representation in Sri Lankan politics remained minimal, with only 4.5% of parliamentarians being women. A quota system was later introduced in 2016 to address this disparity. In 2023, a documentary, Our Mother, Grandmother, Prime Minister, Sirimavo, was released, featuring insights from her daughters and grandchildren, and won Best Documentary at the 21st Dhaka International Film Festival. So there you have it, the story of Sirimavo Bandaranaike, the world's first female Prime Minister. A woman who smashed gender barriers and became a democratically elected national leader well before any Western nation. Despite not having a huge impact on the advancements of women's rights and the role of women in politics in Sri Lanka itself, one cannot understate the impact around the world of seeing a woman be democratically elected as leader. I hope you enjoyed this episode of HerStory Buff. Many thanks for listening, and see you next week. Goodbye.